Well, hello and welcome to Critical Weight Theory. So today we're going back to 1985. No, we're not getting into a DeLorean and traveling through time. Instead, it's just me talking about a TV show that happened in 1985. It's the BBC, their shoulder pads, and some gritty London streets. And the very first episode of Cat's Eyes, Season 1, Episode 1, titled Goodbye Jenny Wren. Now, to be honest, I don't recall hearing about Cat's Eyes until recently. And in fact, when I did a little Google search about the show, the Stephen King movie Cat's Eyes, the horror anthology film, was really what it seemed to prefer results for. So, that's a good movie, by the way. And one of these days, I'm sure I will review that one. I mean, time permitting. But this one's a little bit more obscure, especially for American audiences. I'm sure, people over in jolly old England are a little bit more familiar with this show, but it really only lasted a couple seasons. And of course, it's from way back in 1985. I was only 4 years old at the time. So the story here in this episode, it begins in a way that feels both very 1980s and perhaps a little bit surprisingly modern. Now, before I watched it, I had a certain expectation. The name alone of Cat's Eyes sounds like there must be a twist, right? Some sort of weird hook, some secret, um, other than the nature of them being, uh, you know, women who are investigators, and that they do have a name that kind of matches that technically. CATS stands for Covert Activities Thames Section. So naturally, you might assume this is one of those setups where these women are pulled from prison or something, maybe forced into doing undercover work for the Home Office, because they have valuable skills as criminals, and the you know the type of plot here: work for us or finish your sentence in a prison or something like that. That kind of coercive cooperation storyline that always feels dramatic and sort of morally complicated. But here's the thing, that's not what this show is. It's actually straightforward. They're not convicts. They're not being blackmailed into this spy service or whatever. They're simply female detectives working in a covert unit. And that alone in 1985, that might have been unusual enough, because there really weren't a lot of police shows that had prominent women characters back in the 1980s. I don't know if this was the very first show like that, but it's actually a spin-off from a show that had some female characters. And the series was created by Terrence Feely, who had a real knack for blending action with character driven storytelling, at least from what I understand. I can't say I'm personally that familiar with his work, but he seems like he was kind of respected in his field. And you can, tell from the pilot that, it was a very I guess cutting edge show for the time, because like I said, there just weren't that many shows where women were prominent as characters in police dramas or whatever. And you get the sense that these female characters have to sort of prove themselves in a in a male dominated work environment. So let's talk about those characters. First, there's, I might be getting them mixed up a little bit, so I apologize for that. But I'm not that familiar with this show, and even though I watched the premiere episode, I might be getting these details a little bit messed up. But there's Prue Standfast, played by, I believe, Rosalind Lander. I gather that she's a sharp character, controlled and strategic. She's the one who thinks before she moves, probably more than the other characters. She understands power and how to navigate it. And if there's a word for her, it's probably the word agency. And then there's Maggie Forbes, played by Jill Gascoigne. Maggie, from what I recall, I remember her character being streetwise and tough, kind of. You believe that she's seen things, and she carries herself like someone who's had to fight for space in a male dominated workplace. And finally, there's Frederica Fred Smith. You know, I think they mostly call her Fred. She's played by Leslie Ash. Fred is a bit more rebellious, impulsive. She's got the youngest energy in the group. She's kind of like the, I guess, spunky teenager of the trio, really. She's the kind of character who acts first and deals with consequences later. And you can already see how that's going to complicate things with the story and with this series overall. And hovering over all of them is their controller, played by Don Warrington. He's stern, controlled, pragmatic. He's not cartoonishly authoritarian, but definitely still holding the leash, so to speak. And that power imbalance is pretty clear from the start. And there's a little bit of sense of a sense that they're combative to him a little bit. You know, he's not really their pal. He's sort of like a thorn in their side a little bit. And it's a he's also a black dude. I'm just gonna say it. You know, he's a black dude, and I don't know how well the characters really get along together. They kind of seem at odds with each other, and in that sense, it might be a little bit realistic. I can't imagine that everybody, who is a detective or on the police force or whatever, I can't imagine everybody getting along and having the same things in common all the time. And let's look at the episode more itself a little bit. So it's around the 32-minute mark, and it really clicked for me what the show is doing, at least. It's not just about solving a case. The episode introduces the women's, we get to see how their dynamics, how they play off of each other and stuff like that. We see them in their own spaces and under their own pressures. There's a story here about like a Russian ship. Like that's basically what's going on in the episode. And there's distrust here, personality clashes, a sense that none of them fully signed up for this version of the job. And that tension is sort of the engine of the episode. Of course, there is some action here and there. In fact, one of the characters, you know, one of the cat's eyes characters dies. It's not one of the trio that I mentioned, just so you know, but it happens very early on in the episode, so it's not really that much of a spoiler. And that there's like a hint that the Russians are up to no good and all that kind of stuff. So it's they're detectives, they're investigating the ship and whatnot. And then there's a bit of a cuter story about a married man who's having an affair, and they're trying to detect his affair and prove it to the man's wife or whatever. And that's kind of a fun little thing. It's it might be considered a little bit of a steamier story, I guess, because of the sexuality of the affair and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's more there just to make it a little bit more comical, I guess. And the uh, the death of the character who dies is named Jenny, and she's played by Catherine Rabbit, Rabett, and her fate casts a shadow over everything. It's not just a plot device; it feels like a warning that, hey, there's actually a possibility that the characters could die in this series. I mean, we're literally given that sort of information very early on. So it kind of ups the stakes a little bit, and it makes you get the sense that these characters, these women, are against some real bad people who are willing to take human lives or whatever. So you get an idea of what could happen to these women in this line of work, and the cost of going undercover, and who do you become when you're constantly pretending to be someone else, which is kind of what you do if you're a detective, you know. You're you're not always spying necessarily, but you're kind of putting on a false front or whatever. And identity is one of the key themes here. You know, who these women are, who they're forced to be on the job, and whether there's redemption in this line of work. You know, it's a world built on deception basically. That's what these women kind of experience all the time. And you know, they're very professional about it, but you get the sense that it's a high stress job and that there's a lot of pressure that these characters have to deal with. And tonally, for a mid 1980s BBC production, it's it's got that 1980s BBC production vibe. You know, it's gritty. I love the 1980s synth heavy theme to the show. By the way, it's classic, and that kind of drew me right in. You know, I knew I was in for a retro experience right away. It's not a glamorous show. It's not glossy. There's a grounded reality to it, and the fact that this is female-led action at the time, I think that really is a significant part of the show. It wasn't common on British television, like I said, and I like that these women weren't sidekicks to some male team or whatever. You know, they're not just love interests orbiting a male hero. They're really the story here, and that's pretty cool. I kind of like that. And the show is somewhere between a traditional British police procedural and a more character driven spy thriller or something like that. Not that I've watched a lot of British spy or police shows, but you know, I think this was trying to be something different, you know. And you know, I think this pilot was pretty solid overall. I didn't I didn't absolutely fall in love with the series, but I could see continuing to watch it. It there I like the power dynamics here. There's a bit of a moral tension, a sense that this unit is both an opportunity and a trap in a way. And Cat's Eyes only ran for two series, as they called it them in England. You know, it's a little bit confusing in America because we call TV shows series, but they call seasons series over there. And you know, it's a little bit hard to find this show officially. I think you can find it on YouTube though, at least some of the episodes. That's where I happen to watch this premiere episode, this movie length premiere episode. So yeah, that's another one of those interesting examples of things that are borderline being lost. And I guess it's because it's in some legal limbo or something like that. But you can probably find episodes of this series on the internet somewhere. And, you know, I might watch future episodes and see where I can find them. But it doesn't seem like Cat's Eyes is going to get an official release anytime soon, because there hasn't been one yet. I don't know how much of a demand there is for it to appear on DVD or on streaming services or anything like that. But you know, it was kind of nice to watch this as a bit of like a nostalgia for the 1980s thing. And you know, my experience with British television or UK television is very limited in the first place. I've watched Monty Python. My grandma enjoyed, you know, the Benny Hill show, and she also watched uh a show called Keeping Up Appearances, which was very funny. So, other than that, though, I don't have a whole lot of experience watching British television. There have been a few things here and there, but this is actually, one of the few British shows I've watched so far. And I guess it was a little bit interesting. And I probably will watch some extra episodes of this if I can find them and review those as well. So, I didn't go into too much detail about the story in this episode. Um, Frankly, I think there isn't a whole lot to talk about other than what I just went over. Um, but anyway, let me know your thoughts on Cat's Eyes. Do you like the show? Um, do you wish it had lasted longer? Do you think it was sort of doomed to fail? Or do you think it made some unique choices that led to it lasting for only two series, as the Brits call it? Anyway, that's about it for now. I don't think I have anything more to say about the episode. Just have a good day.